Hey, this is Seth Parnell, the minister at the Portia Church of Christ, and this is episode 118 of the Midweek Bible Study. Hope that you are doing well. Hope things are going good for you. We appreciate you being here, and hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. There's a lot going on, this week. It's a really busy time, of the year. We got, school starting back. We got, football season starting up, which is good. Hope your team wins. Go Hogs, go Dolphins, and you got a lot of busy stuff going on. But I hope that your weekend was good, and we appreciate you being here tonight. Whether you're joining us now or whether you join us later on, we want you to know that you're appreciated, and we always welcome you here to join us in our study as we seek to gain a better understanding of the Word of God and to be someone who grows in our faith, because that's what we want to do. We want to grow closer to God. We want to be someone that always grows closer to Him. We also want to let you know too that we have that you are welcome to attend services with us at Portia. Physically. We are right now. We are meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and 5 o'clock for Sunday night, and 6 o'clock for Wednesday night. And so if you're in our area, I hope that you can join us, and we would love to see you. We would love to talk with you and worship with you. We would love to be around you. I know we have right now on Sunday morning, I believe we are in Ephesians. We're studying the book of Ephesians, and I know it's going to be a good study. The letters of Paul are always a pretty deep study, so I know you're going to enjoy that. And so that's Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock, and on Wednesday nights we're going through the book of Matthew, and we're on I think we're ending chapter 16 right now, and we're just going through the different interactions that Jesus has throughout the book. And it's really interesting to see all the things that go on from the birth of Jesus, through his ministry, and now we're getting closer to some of the interactions that he has with the Pharisees. He's getting closer to the kind of the end point of the Gospels, and so it's a really, really good study. And so I hope if you're in the area, I hope you can join us for that. We would love to have you, and love to have your contributions, to our study, because all are certainly welcome in that. It's good to have Cheryl here. I hope that you are doing good. It's good to see you too. I hope things are going well for you. Always good to see you around here. And we also got Ted Knight here is with us as well. Hope you are doing fantastic, as well. It's always great to have you here, and hope you had a great week. It's always good to have you here. But let's see what else we have. Also, if you have any questions or comments about what we're studying tonight, feel free to get in contact with us. We'd love to help you, love to talk with you, and clear up any misunderstandings that we might have. And so feel free to, and if you want to suggest like a topic for a future episode, if you're sitting at home and thinking, well, I think Ephesians, chapter 3, verse, 15. I don't know what that is, but I think that would be a good topic for an episode. Send that our way and tell us, why you think that would be a good episode. We'd love to hear from you. But you have that available to you, or not a hard person to get a hold of, and so you can just send it our way. Good to have the Malins here as well. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope you're holding down McClamrock Street, holding that down tight. We always love seeing you guys here, and I hope everything's going well in Portia and at the Hoxie Church of Christ. Hope you guys are going 100% up there. So it's good to have you here. But tonight we are going to take a look at II Chronicles chapter 33, and that's for me. If I turn there in a physical Bible, that takes me a little bit to find II Chronicles. It's not as bad as Lamentations or something, but still it might take me a little bit to find the II Chronicles. But II Chronicles chapter 33 is where we are going to be. And let me get this up here, and we will get started. Here we go. This is the ESV version that I usually put up here. And so if you have a King James, it might differ a little bit, or a New King James or an American Standard, those might differ a little bit, but I usually use ESV when I'm teaching here. It's good to have Carlene here. Hope you're doing well, and I'm glad you're joining us tonight. So she's all ears, and so it's good to have you here. Hope we can have a good study tonight. But we know that we're all familiar with the request that was made to Samuel. Samuel, who was someone who was getting on in years, and he was one of the great leaders of Israel. He was someone that did a lot for them. He was a really faithful man to God. He was a brilliant leader, but his biggest enemy was that of time. People, we all have a time in which we live on this earth, and then our time is up. Age caught up to Samuel, and his sons turned out to be not very good people, not worthy of the standard that he has set forth for himself. And so the people, they come to Samuel and they basically say, your sons are no good, and you're not getting any younger. You're not going to be around for very much longer. Why don't you appoint for us a king that can go out before us in battle? He can rule over us. He can be out there for us. So, Samuel, you're our judge. You're our leader. Appoint for us a king. And we know that he eventually did. After he consulted God, God said, go ahead. They haven't rejected you, but they have rejected me. And so he goes ahead and sets up a king. Saul. King Saul becomes the first king of Israel. He doesn't turn out all that well. He was someone who started out pretty good, but kind of degraded as his reign went on. Eventually getting kind of paranoid and power hungry. Someone who would chase David all over the countryside because he was afraid that David was going to take his throne. And eventually he would lose his life in a battle with the Philistines. But David, following him, was someone who was a man after God's own heart. And he would become one of the great kings of Israel, maybe some say one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. And a lot of promises were made to David concerning his line and concerning the kings that would follow him. And these promises would be kept up through the southern kingdom. After the death of Solomon, during the reign of Rehoboam, the kingdom was split in two, to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom is what would carry the line of David. And while the northern kingdom would be a lot worse than the southern kingdom, but even though the southern kingdom would have their problems, but it would continue on that line. And I think a couple episodes back we took a look at Hezekiah, who was a very good king. He was one of the greater kings of the southern kingdom. He did a lot of reforms. He was very faithful to God. He had a few slip-ups himself, but he was someone who did a lot in bringing the people, back to God. He was a very faithful king, very good person. But just like Samuel, just like others, he only had so much time here on this earth. And eventually he would have to pass it over to his son, a man by the name of Manasseh. And some people say it would be well before Manasseh was ready for this. But if you look here on the screen, we're going to read a couple of verses here to see what how this turns out. II Chronicles, chapter 33, starting in verse 1. It says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had broken down. And he erected altars to the Baals, and made Ashtaroth, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord, and with which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem shall my name be forever. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. And he burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and used fortune telling and omens and sorcery, and dealt with mediums and with necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. And he carved the image of the idol that he had made, he set in the house of God, of which God said to David and to his Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will no more remove the foot of Israel from the land that I appointed for your fathers, if only they will be careful to do all that I have commanded them, all the law, the statutes, and the rules given through Moses. Manasseh led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. And so we know, as is the pattern, with the Kings and the Chronicles, they will list off a king, and then right after they give the name of the king, they will kind of give a synopsis of whether this king was good or whether he was evil, from kind of what he did, whether he was faithful to God or whether he was not, and then they'll give reasons why. If you look at, the introduction to Hezekiah, it's a very glowing report of what he did and the things that he had provided, for Israel as far as spiritually leading them. Manasseh, his son, is another story. He's someone who, and if you look at verse 2, it says, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. One of the reasons, why Israel had to go into the land of Canaan the way that they did was because the people there that were living there were morally bankrupt. They were corrupt. They were doing things that were well and far beyond what God wanted people to do. They were a very, very evil people, and that's why their influence in Israel was very important. But they had the standard of immorality was to these nations that Israel drove out. And this description that starts out here says, this is what Manasseh followed. He followed after the standard of evil that the nations around them had, and it would not be a good thing. But it's also interesting to note that he was quite young when he took over this job. It says he was 12 years old when he began to reign, and we know that it's all likelihood that he didn't make all the decisions. He didn't preside over the traditional role of a king at 12 years old, most likely. But most likely he had a lot of help. He had kind of a steward or people to help him along until he got to that age to where he could make his competent decisions, to where he could lead the people effectively. And some say he got this job too early, or either that or the person that was in charge of guiding him and helping him along was someone that was not spiritually minded, because as his father was someone who was very faithful, Manasseh would go in the completely opposite direction. And I think verses from verses like 2 down to verse 9, it lists all these things that Manasseh did, all these evil things that he partook in. It always brings to my mind, at least in part when we look at this, how important it is, to educate and to teach, our young people, the next generation, about, spiritual things, about, spiritual maturity, about, being someone who has, spiritual interests, or someone who puts their trust in God and not in other things. Because obviously Manasseh didn't have this. He didn't have that anchor of looking to God, even though he was very young. We may not think much of teaching, young people today, kids who are, 10 or 12 years old. You may not think of much of a contribution that they can make, to the grand scheme of things. But when you look at Manasseh here, how far away was he from making real decisions, of making an incredible impact on the entire nation? We know that we're not going to be kings of a nation, but look at the time for, Manasseh was just a child, basically, to the time in which he was a spiritual guide to Israel. It's not very long. Time flies. It's not the time in which a person, goes from a child to someone who is making these real decisions. is often a very fast time. And so it's so important, for us to be someone who takes the time to teach, our kids, to teach those 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 year olds, to help them to develop a faith of their own and help them to develop, a trust in God. Because when they get to a position where they're making decisions that affect other people, they'll be an influence, for good, and not someone that, turns people away from God. That verse that says, train up a child in the way that he goes, so when he's old, he will not depart from it. A lot of times, people, when they draw on those lessons that they were taught when they were young. And Manasseh here, even though his father was such a great example, he didn't have that for him. And so it's so important for us to take the time to teach those young ones, because like I said, if we don't, then we're going to end up with a generation that's making decisions that affect people who have no concern for spiritual things. And that can be a real problem. And as we'll see here in the story of Manasseh, the amount of damage that he did, as someone who had no care for trusting in God, was incredible. And so this has to be something that we're invested in, whether it be through, developing personal relationships, or having, Bible classes, or church camps, or anything of that matter that kind of plants these seeds in these young people. We have to be someone that's willing to invest in that, because it will be no time at all, as you said, before they start making decisions that affects people. And we need them to be positive influence, and not something that tears people down. Because as we'll see here next, that's exactly what Manasseh did. Because he's not someone that just did a little bit of evil, but he was someone who went all the way. And just take a look at some of the things that he did here. Starting in verse 3, it says that he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had broken down, and erected altars to the Baals, and made Ashtaroth, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and served him. So if you look at the previous chapters and look at all the reforms that Hezekiah did, and how he tore down the altars, he tore down the idols, and everything of that, his son, as soon as when he gets back in charge, he reverses all of that. He builds those things back up. And these things weren't done immediately. They were done over a period of time, but still, this is something that Manasseh has done. He reversed all the reforms that his father had did. That he worshipped all the host of heaven, so the sun and the moon and the stars. He worshipped those things instead of worshiping God. He worshipped the sun. He worshipped the moon. He worshipped those things. It says that he built altars for all the hosts of heaven and the two courts of the house of the Lord. So instead of just going out to a hill outside of Jerusalem and building these altars to the sun or altars to the moon, instead of building it out in the courtyards in the city, he goes into the temple of God, to the place of worship, the place in which was dedicated to the worship of God, and he puts these idolatrous altars in there. And that's one thing to worship an idol. It's another thing to put it in the house of God and use that to worship it. It's not the same thing. It's a poor example, but imagine someone using the church building which you worship at for a group that worships Satan, or worships a something that is extremely immoral. It's not a great example, not a great comparison, but he had no shame. Basically, he had no concern for God, to the point where his lack of shame led him to put these altars in the very house of God. And verse 6, it says that he burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom. And which, as he said, this took a period of time, because at 12 years old, he's not going to have, any sons. And so that's going to take some time to develop, but when he did have children, it says that he sacrificed, some of them, to Molech, or to the the God that people offered child sacrifices to, which is it's completely it's hard to think that somebody would do that, that would actually burn a child alive because they want to please an inanimate object. That's hard for us to comprehend, but yet this is what he did. This is the lack of concern he had for life. And he certainly, as he said, he went all out. And he's not the only king that did this. There was others that did this as well. And it was one of the worst practices that the people in the land of Canaan did. But another example of how his decisions would affect other people, even the innocent and those that couldn't defend themselves, his children, paid the price for that. Verse, and then continue on, he says, he used fortune telling and omens and sorcery, and he dealt with mediums and necromancers, and he did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. It reminds you of the story of Saul when he was, getting frightened. He sought out a sorcerer who called up the spirit of Samuel, and he had a conversation with Samuel after he had departed. And there's some controversy, some debate about what actually happened there, but with the witch at Endor. But it's though God had very explicit instructions for Israel. Don't mess with these type of people. Don't interact. Don't be someone who's involved with these types of people. The sorcerers and the mediums and the necromancers. A necromancer is someone who speaks to the dead or calls up the dead. God said, don't have anything to do with that, but rather, if you find these people in your midst, put them to death. That was the law that God had, and so that's how serious he was about avoiding these people. As we see here with Manasseh, he had no shame, and so he interacted with these people a lot. Verse 7, it says, they carved the image of the idol that he had made, and he set it in the house of God. Again, using the temple of God in order to sacrifice to idols. And it recalls a statement that says, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will no more remove the foot of Israel from the land that I appointed for your fathers, if only they will be careful to do all that I have commanded them. Well, certainly Manasseh was doing something that God did not command, and was certainly doing the opposite of what he led. And so he in verse 9 it says that he led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray, to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. And so, as we said here, this explains, just how far down this road of evil that Manasseh went, and how much he invested he was in completely obliterating, the reforms that his father had made, and turning people back to trusting, in God. If you take a look at the account, I believe in 2 Kings, it says that he's someone who also shed a lot of innocent blood, and so he killed a lot of people, as well. This was not a good guy. He was someone who he was someone who had a lot of problems in looking at the things that he did. He went the extra mile when it came to being evil. But thankfully, for Manasseh, and thankfully, for as someone who likes happy endings. I'm someone who likes a happy ending. I don't want anyone to suffer or anyone to see evil. But Manasseh has a change of heart, and this doesn't come of his own volition. But if you take a look here in verses 10, and following, it says that he's going to have a change in perspective as he goes on throughout his a very lengthy reign of 55 years. In verse 10, it says, the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks, and bound him with chains of bronze, and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty, and heard his plea, and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Very interesting that we see here, where he says, in verse 10, it says, the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, through the mouth of prophets, but they paid no attention. They did not listen. They did not, heed, what they had to say. And we don't have any biblical support for it, but tradition, says that Isaiah was killed by Manasseh during this period. And so, like I said, we don't have any biblical, sources for that, but it's likely, or maybe it's possible, that Isaiah, was killed, during this time. And tradition says that he was sawn in two, is how he was killed. And Manasseh could have been a culprit for that, but he said that he did not listen. But then some unfortunate things happened, to Manasseh. It says that king of Assyria, and verse 11 makes sure to point out that this was the Lord doing this. He said the Lord brought upon the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh and brought him away to Babylon. And if you're familiar with, the Assyrians, ruled over Babylon at this time. Later on, the Babylonians would rise to power, after the Assyrians, and they would be the one that would eventually carry off the southern kingdom into captivity. But at this time, the Assyrians, rule over the Babylonians. And so they bring him to Babylon. And in verse 12, it says, and when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God, and humbled himself, greatly before the God of his fathers. I find it very interesting that it says this here, because when Manasseh was beaten down, when he was someone that his life was threatened, he didn't have anywhere to go. He had no answers. He was someone who was in such a deep, situation. He didn't call out to the sun. He didn't call out, to the moon. He didn't, call out to Baal or to Ashtaroth, or he didn't, call out to these other things. It says that he entreated, the favor of the Lord his God, and he humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He went when he was in real trouble. He turned to God for any of these false things, which kind of makes you think. At least it makes me think that in the back of his mind, even though he did all these evil things, more evil than a lot of these kings combined, with all the wrong things that he did, I think maybe in the back of his mind, Manasseh knew that this was all wrong. He knew that, God, the one true God was God. That he knew that the God that his father served, was, the true God, of this earth. And maybe it was, in that, serving these false gods allowed him to do whatever he wanted. He didn't have to follow the law of God. He could kind of make up his own moral code if he followed the promiscuous, oftentimes, worship of these false gods. But it seems that even though he was so evil, he knew who was the true God, even though he didn't want to acknowledge God, because when he was in real trouble, he entreated, God. And it says that God, he was moved by his entreaty, and he heard his plea. A lot of times, suffering is something that isn't good, and we wouldn't wish, suffering on anybody. But sometimes the suffering, that we go through is of our own doing. Sometimes our own mistakes, our own decisions that cause us, to suffer. That certainly was the case with Manasseh here. But even though we don't want suffering to be put on anybody, but sometimes suffering can be a good thing. And sometimes we can learn to have good things come out of suffering, because sometimes when you are, knocked down and you're hit over the head by what life, throws at you, sometimes that wakes you up, and that maybe kind of, rattles your cage to where you start thinking about, where do I really need to be? Who do I really need to be trusting in this situation? that seems like this is what happened to Manasseh here, because when his cage was rattled and he was you know brought into this very, very deep situation in these deep waters, he went back to God, because I think in the back of my mind he knew that he was the only one that could help, and God heard him. And so we can take positive things from suffering. Sometimes when we're going through those tough times, we need to ask ourselves, can I learn anything from this? Can this be something that wakes me up to where I need to be, to the perspective that I need to have? Because this will completely change Manasseh's life, as we'll see later on here. Because in the last verse it says, then Manasseh, or in verse 13, then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. And that's a powerful kind of a statement to make. Then it says afterwards he built an outer wall, and he was someone who did a lot of construction. And he says that he built the entrance to the fish gate. And if you look down to verse 15 here, it says that he took away the foreign gods and the idols from the house of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city. He restored the altar of the Lord and offered on it sacrifices of peace offerings and of thanksgiving. And he commanded Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. Nevertheless, the people still sacrificed at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. You see, one thing that's good for Manasseh, one thing that's a very positive end to his story, is that he didn't just entreat God to get out of trouble. He didn't just entreat God to get him out of the situation. But once he was restored back to his position of power, he followed through. It says that he took all those idols and all those things that were put in the temple in the house of God, and he threw them out of the city where they belonged. He threw them out and got rid of them. It says that he tore down those altars. He restored the altar of God. He's someone who he removed all these things and set the people on a course back to serving the one true God. And they started offering sacrifices to him, and Manasseh followed through with this. And so he reminds me so much of Paul. When you read about Paul in the New Testament, when he was Saul of Tarsus, he did so many wrong things. He persecuted Christians. He consented to their death. He dragged them away. He tried to get them to denounce Jesus. He did all those things. But when he was woken up, when he had that conversion on the road to Damascus, and when he was baptized by Ananias, his life was completely changed, and he started evangelizing and putting forth the gospel message. And this is what Manasseh did. And I'm not sure about the timeline. In his 55-year reign, I'm not sure how much was evil and how much was good, but he followed through with that. And it appears that he was someone who was committed to turn the people back to God, even though he did all these wrong things in the end and in the beginning. And so to kind of wrap this lesson up and kind of wrap this look at II Chronicles 33, it goes back to the forgiveness of God. When you think about what can God forgive, and what can God what can he use? Even someone who was as evil as Manasseh, even someone who was so committed to all these wrong things, to killing children, to using the temple of God as a house of pagan worship, and with all the pagan rituals and all the wrong things that went along with that. God took someone like that, and he was still concerned about that person, and he used him to restore Israel back to a good place. God can forgive if we're someone who's willing to come back to him. The depths of God's forgiveness is hard for us to understand, but it's one of the most fortunate things about God, is that he's able to forgive us at our worst. And that's certainly something that we can be grateful for, because it's one thing to, overlook someone when they're at their best, but when they're at their very worst, when they are, guilty of wrongdoing and they are in a very unflattering position, God still, takes the hand of that person, and he still says, I will forgive you if you will come back. It's up to us whether we come back or not. God's not going to save you, against, your own free will or against your own, consent, but he will, take you back if you're someone who's willing to come back. Our God, forgives. And so it's important, to be someone who is, to be a church that is invested in teaching our young people, because they will be someone who will be making decisions that affect people in no time flat. We need to recognize, that evil, is evil, and that if we're dedicated, to those things that are evil, then that's going to cause consequences in the future. We know that sometimes there are things we can learn from our suffering. Sometimes suffering is something that wakes us up and gives us a perspective of where we should be and trusting in God. And we also know that God forgives. He's someone who forgives people even when they make such such incredible mistakes as Manasseh did in this case. And so hopefully this is something that we can learn from him and from his, well, it's quite a remarkable turnaround in the Old Testament here. But I hope that's something that has benefited you tonight. We've gone quite long for a kind of a single episode, without a guest. Kind of went a little bit over of what we intended to, but hopefully this was something that was beneficial, to you. And the Maylands say good lesson. I appreciate it and hope you got something that benefited you guys and all who hear it. If you're someone who is looking for another episode, we'll be back next Thursday for another edition. We're on here every Thursday night, on our Facebook page and our YouTube page at 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. And so hopefully you can join us then. We would love to have you, love to hear from you. And because we're going to have, I think we're going to have some guests coming up in the future. Usually we kind of get them in waves, so it might be another week, but we'll have 3 or 4 guests coming up in the future, and so you can look out for that, as we continue to go on. But until next time, we hope that you have, like I said, hope you have a wonderful week and a wonderful weekend as we kind of finish out, this week in September, and hope you can go out and be the light of the world and glorify God in everything that you do. We'll catch you next time.